Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Before we take up the analysis of today's newspaper, I would like to inform you that tomorrow, that is the 29th of August, Mukesh Jasar will be holding a workshop on the preparation strategy for current affairs. So I would urge all of you to take part in this workshop by registering yourselves in the link that would be provided in the description box below. So with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an editorial from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This editorial deals with the recent appointment of 9 judges to the Supreme Court. In a landmark development, the President of India has approved the appointment of 9 judges to the Supreme Court in one go, based on the recommendations that were provided by the Supreme Court's collegium. So the decision of the Government of India to accept the recommendations of the Supreme Court's collegium and provide for the appointment of 9 judges, that too at one go, is seen as a sign of increasing cooperation between the judiciary and the executive. The judiciary and the executive are two important organs in a constitutional democracy, and as per the doctrine of separation of powers, and in the interest of maintaining judicial independence, the executive does not get to play any direct role in the selection of the judges to the Supreme Court. The judicial appointment process in India is controlled by the Supreme Court's collegium, which consists of 5 members, including the Chief Justice of India and 4 senior-most judges of the Supreme Court. This collegium provides for the appointment and transfer of judges, and this system of appointment has been constitutionally upheld by the Supreme Court through various judgments delivered in the first judge's case of 1981 and the second judge's case of 1993 and the third judge's case of 1998. So as per the latest amendments, the Supreme Court has a total sanctioned strength of 34 judges, including the Chief Justice of India, and to fill these vacancies, the Supreme Court's collegium comes up with a list of recommendations. This is a purely internal process within the judiciary, where the collegium consults with senior-most judges of the Supreme Court and concerned judges of the High Court, and in most cases, it follows the principle of seniority and recommends a list of names to be appointed as judges of the Supreme Court by the government. As per Article 124 of the Constitution, the powers to appoint judges to the Supreme Court rest with the President of India. This, of course, is not a discretionary power of the President. Here, the President is guided and bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. So once the recommendations of the collegium are received by the Law Ministry, the names are forwarded to the Intelligence Bureau for a background check, following which the government either has to recommend to the President to appoint these judges, or in case if the government has any reservations about the recommended names, it can ask the collegium to reconsider the recommendation once. But if the collegium recommends the same names again, then the government would be bound to make these appointments. But however, since the Constitution doesn't mention any specific timeline, the government can hold back the appointments and sit on the recommendations in case it has any reservations about the recommended names. So this constitutional loophole has always resulted in a tussle between the judiciary and the executive, and in many cases, the executive has delayed the appointments for several months even after the recommendations have been received from the Supreme Court's collegium. In fact, over the last 2 years, a similar standoff had resulted between the judiciary and the executive, and nearly 10 vacancies were pending in the Supreme Court. These unfilled vacancies, as a result of the conflict between the collegium and the government, directly affects the functioning of the Supreme Court and its efficiency, thereby resulting in judicial delays and backlogs. That is the reason why the latest appointment of 9 judges, that too in one go, is a major development, because it shows a sign of cooperation between the collegium and the government. And after receiving a list of 9 recommended names, the government went ahead quickly and recommended the names to the President, who in turn has signed the warrants of appointment as per Article 124, thereby providing for the appointment of these judges to the Supreme Court, which increases its strength to 33 out of the sanctioned 34. So this sign of cooperation between the Supreme Court's collegium and the executive is a welcome step and a positive sign. And upon that, In the latest round of appointments, the Supreme Court's collegium has done well by promoting greater diversity and representation at the Supreme Court. Out of these 9 judges who have been recommended, 3 of them happen to be women, thus promoting gender diversity at the Supreme Court, which had been seriously lacking for several years. And along with that, the Supreme Court's collegium has chosen these judges from across the country, thereby providing for enough regional diversity at the Supreme Court. Amongst all these appointments, the appointment of Justice B.V. Nagaratna from the Karnataka High Court is a major landmark development because now Justice B.V. Nagaratna is all set to become the first woman Chief Justice of India in 2027 as per the list of seniority. So the editorial welcomes these positive signs, which shows increasing cooperation between the executive and the judiciary, and as well as the improving diversity and representation at the Supreme Court. But however, there are few concerns to be flagged as well, because whenever the Supreme Court's collegium recommends names for appointment, the center has often shown sensitivity and concerns about a few names. And even though the concerned judge meets the seniority requirement and merit requirement, their names have often been dropped later by the collegium in order to strike a compromise with the executive. There are instances where suitable judges have been excluded without a valid or a justifiable reason, which is most likely to address the sensitivities of the center, especially the political sensitivities of the center with regard to the appointment of a few judges. In the latest round of appointments as well, Justice Akhil Qureshi, the Chief Justice of Tripura High Court, has been left out by the Supreme Court's collegium despite having the right eligibility and qualification, largely because the center had reservations about this judge. While such a compromise might be necessary in certain circumstances, especially in the interest of speeding up judicial appointments, but if such compromises become the norm, and if the collegium is always being forced to compromise based on center sensitivities, the two political sensitivities, then it amounts to executive's intervention in the appointment process of the judges. That would violate the doctrine of separation of powers and defeat the very purpose of the collegium system, which is often criticized for being opaque and non-transparent, as the Supreme Court has always seen the collegium system as a form of protection against any executive intervention in the appointment process. For example, in 2014, when the Government of India tried to reform the judicial appointment process by introducing the 99th Constitutional Amendment Act, the Supreme Court took a firm stand against it and even struck down the constitution of the National Judicial Appointments Commission for being unconstitutional, as it gave the executive a direct role in the appointment process, which was found to be violative of the doctrine of separation of powers by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court then declared NJAC as unconstitutional, and it restored back the collegium system. So if the objective of the collegium system is to protect the judiciary from executive's interference, and if the Supreme Court is defending the collegium system despite criticism against its opaqueness and non-transparency, then it will have to stop working out such compromises with the center, especially on political grounds. Because excluding meritorious and senior judges who are otherwise suitable would end up eroding the independence of the judiciary, as such interference allows the executive to have a say in the appointment process. Now let's take up another editorial from page number 6, which deals with the explosive security situation that is emerging in India's immediate neighborhood, which is threatening to seriously compromise India's national security interests. First, we have the volatile situation in Afghanistan following the Taliban takeover, and the concerns of anti-India terrorist outfits gaining a foothold in Taliban-ruled Afghanistan is increasingly becoming a major security threat. Then in the same volatile region, we have continued tensions with Pakistan along the line of control, along with Pakistan's continued sponsorship of cross-border terrorism and anti-India terror outfits. Then to this existing complex situation, if you add the ongoing tensions with China along the line of actual control, you get a deadly combination which could severely compromise India's national security interests in the coming years. So in the middle of this emerging situation, India's foreign minister has informed an all-party meeting that India would be adopting a wait-and-watch approach especially with regard to the emerging situation in Afghanistan. But the editorial is of the opinion that India cannot afford to follow a wait and watch approach, especially in Afghanistan. If India has to protect its national security interests, then it will have to proactively engage in the region, primarily to contain the threat of terrorism that emanates from Taliban ruled Afghanistan. In the present evolving situation, there are two major security threats for India, one represented by ISIS K or Islamic State in the Khorasan province, and the other is the threat posed by the Haqqani network, which has a history of targeting Indian interests in Afghanistan. The devastating terror attack that took place a couple of days ago at the Kabul airport has already been claimed by ISIS K, or also abbreviated as ISKP, which stands for Islamic State in the Khorasan province. And this deadly terror attack has left more than 180 people dead, including American soldiers. And it only represents the growing foothold that the Islamic State in the Khorasan province has been gaining in this part of Afghanistan. In fact, on page number 13, the Hindu profiles this emerging terrorist outfit and highlights how ISIS K or ISKP can be a major security concern for India. See, today in Afghanistan, the Taliban, which has captured power, shares intense rivalry with the Islamic State in the Khorasan province. This new terror outfit was formed somewhere in 2015, and it is seen as an affiliate of the main branch of ISIS or the Islamic State, which is centered around the Syria Iraq region. ISIS K or ISKP seeks to establish an Islamic caliphate, which it refers to as the Khorasan province, which roughly includes parts of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. This terror outfit has also made several references in the past of including parts of India as well as a part of the so-called Islamic Caliphate in the Khorasan province. Security and counterterrorism experts are still not clear as to what extent the leaders of ISIS-K are connected with the top leaders of ISIS in the Iraq-Syria region. But however, ideologically and with regard to their operational tactics, they do share a lot of similarities. And back then, ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi had even acknowledged that ISIS-K or ISKP is a branch of the Islamic State. This branch of the Islamic State predominantly operates in the Nangarhar province of Afghanistan, and today it is in a position to extend its influence across western, southern, and eastern parts of Afghanistan. Indian intelligence agencies have noted that this terror outfit has been raising recruits from across South Asia, West Asia, and Central Asia, and more alarmingly, several Indian nationals have also been self radicalized, and many of them have even traveled to the Nangarhar province and other parts of Afghanistan to join the ISIS K and fight on its behalf. Intelligence inputs indicate that ISIS K has also been receiving several recruits from other related terrorist outfits which are operating in the region, many of which have been backed by Pakistan's ISI. Reportedly, terrorists belonging to other outfits such as TTP or Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jamaat-ud-Dawa, the Haqqani network, and the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, they have either joined ISIS-K or they have aligned with their ideology, thus creating a deadly cocktail with reported connections to Pakistani intelligence agency. Amongst these terror outfits, the Lashkar, Jamaat-ud-Dawa, and Haqqani network have been used by Pakistan's ISI as proxies to target India. So, in the light of this emerging threat, a rivalry has emerged in Afghanistan between the Taliban, which has captured power, and the Islamic State in the Khorasan province. Say, with regard to their radical ideology, they share similarities. Both are Sunni extremist outfits influenced by radical ideologies of Wahhabism and Salafism. But however, with regard to their political objectives, they have a lot of differences. See, until recently, the Taliban has maintained complete monopoly not just over the politics of Afghanistan, but also over jihad and fundamentalism in the Afghanistan region. So now it is facing a formidable challenge being posed by ISKP, and there is intense rivalry emerging between these outfits. The Taliban, which has captured political power in the country, is more interested in forming the future government of Afghanistan, and it essentially happens to be a tribal nationalist militant group. So, the main focus of the Taliban is to form the future government of Afghanistan, and it sees itself as a nationalist militant group. Whereas ISKP, on the other hand, does not respect any national boundaries, and its sole objective is to establish the so called Islamic Caliphate, covering parts of Afghanistan, Pakistan, Central Asia, and reportedly even India. So, back in 2020, when the US struck a deal with Taliban, they both were on the same side with regard to their opposition to ISKP and as well as other terrorist groups that have a base in Afghanistan, such as the Al Qaeda, because these two terror groups have the capabilities and the potential to target American interests. And hence, while signing the peace deal with Taliban, the US wanted assurances from the Talibani leadership that such terror groups won't be tolerated on Afghan soil. This was also in the interest of Taliban as it shared political rivalry with ISKP. But now it's not clear as to what extent the Taliban can control or rein in these terror outfits. And there is a very good possibility that at least a few members of the Taliban in the middle and lower ranks might already be working with such terrorist outfits, even while the top leaders of Taliban are seeking global legitimacy for the future government of Taliban. Then, upon that, we have the Haqqani network, which has rose to prominence again, led by Sirajuddin Haqqani. And this notorious terrorist group has frequently targeted Indian interests in Afghanistan, including deadly terror attacks against the Indian embassy and consulates in Afghanistan. Particularly the suicide attacks against the Indian embassy in Kabul in 2008-2009 was devastating in its impact as it led to the death of several Indian officials, and it has long been suspected that the Haqqani network is one of the proxies of Pakistan's ISI. So now the concern for India is that Sirajuddin Haqqani, the leader of the Haqqani network, has become the deputy to the chief of the Taliban. Taliban chief Habatullah Akhundzada, along with the other top leaders, are seeking global legitimacy from governments around the world, including from the United Nations, to form the future government. And in all likelihood, terrorists such as Sirajuddin Haqqani could become a part of the power structure in Afghanistan. And this is where the challenges arise for India. So, with terror groups like the Haqqani network possibly becoming a part of the Afghan government, and with terror groups like ISKP carrying out deadly terror attacks and threatening Indian interests, will India and the world be ready to accept such a Taliban led government and allow it to occupy Afghanistan's seat at the United Nations? So, considering these threat levels, and considering that the Taliban government, at least the top leadership, wants global recognition, India simply cannot sit idle and adopt a wait and watch approach. Instead, it has to proactively engage in a diplomatic offensive to protect its national security interests. This should begin with a leadership role at the United Nations, especially at the UN Security Council. And currently, India has a golden opportunity as it is not just the non permanent member of the UNSC until 2022, but it also currently occupies the UNSC presidency for the month of August. So, India will have to exploit this position at the UN and rally other countries around it to draw strict red lines for the Taliban leadership, not just with regard to protection of human rights and provision of inclusive representation, including women's rights, but also with regard to placing a strict condition on the Taliban leadership that it has to maintain its distance from these terrorist outfits and work with other governments and the global institutions to counter terrorism in Afghanistan. India will have to use this pressure to keep terrorists such as Sirajuddin Haqqani out of a future Taliban government. And for this, India can find the right leverage at the 1988 Sanctions Committee, which will be chaired by India as a member of the UNSC. Through this Sanctions Committee, 135 Taliban members have been designated as terrorists and sanctions have been applied against them. Their assets have been frozen, there is a travel ban against them, and there is an arms embargo against them. So the Taliban government, which is likely to take shape in the coming weeks, will seek concessions from the UN and other countries in this regard. And India will have to capitalize on this and use this as a leverage to place strict conditions on the Taliban. India will also have to work with the UN General Assembly and its accreditation committee to decide whether Afghanistan's seat should be provided to the future Taliban government, and any such recognition could be made conditional based on Taliban's cooperation in countering terrorism. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is all set to take part in the UN General Assembly summit next month, where he is also likely to take part in the quadrilateral summit along with US, Japan, and Australia. So these platforms will have to be utilized by India to raise its voice and clearly articulate its position over Afghanistan's current situation. And through a proactive diplomatic offensive, it will have to make use of the UN, the Quad grouping, and like minded countries and friends of India. And it will also have to work with regional powers like Iran, China, Central Asian countries, and Russia, and even Pakistan if required, to proactively put in place a containment strategy to ensure that the instability and radicalism in the region doesn't spill over into India, which otherwise could seriously compromise India's national security interests. Now let's look at this article from page number 7, which refers to an attack in Assam reportedly carried out by the Dimasa National Liberation Army or the DNLA. This recently formed extremist outfit has emerged as a major security concern in Assam as it has tried to revive Northeast insurgency, and over the last couple of years, it has carried out several major attacks in the region. The DNLA is an extremist outfit that claims to represent the Dimasa tribe, which is an indigenous ethno-linguistic community found in Assam and parts of Nagaland. The Dimasa people are found to inhabit several autonomous areas which have been granted autonomy under the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution. They are inhabitants of the North Kachar Hills Autonomous District Council, now called as the Dima Hasao Autonomous Council, and the Karbi Anglong Autonomous District, the Kachar District, Nagaon District of Assam, and the Dhansiri region of Nagaland. Even back in the 1990s, a few extremists of the Dimasa tribe had led an armed separatist movement against the Indian state, seeking to liberate the Dimasa inhabited regions to establish the so-called Dimasa Kingdom. But back then, this separatist insurgent movement was brought to a quick end through negotiations and through security operations. And eventually by 2003, India had even signed a ceasefire agreement with the then Dimasa insurgent outfits. Since then, the region had been extremely peaceful. But in 2019, just a couple of years ago, a new Dimasa-based insurgent group has been formed known as the DNLA. This group, based out of Assam, has the stated objective of revamping the so-called national struggle and fight for the liberation of a sovereign, independent Dimasa nation, and it is led by leaders such as Naisodao Dimasa and Karbindao Dimasa, who have even formed a government in exile called as the Dimasa People's Supreme Council. Over the last couple of years, this insurgent group has carried out several major terror attacks in the northeast, especially in Assam, and of late it is emerging as a major security concern for Indian intelligence agencies and security forces. But however, Indian agencies have reasons to believe that the DNLA is just a proxy insurgent outfit that has been propped up by the NSCN Isaac Muiwa faction in order to enable the NSCN to continue its extortion activities along the border regions of Assam and Nagaland, as the NSCN IM cannot directly carry out extortion as it is currently engaged in peace talks with the government of India. Indian agencies also believe that the DNLA can be used as a proxy by the NSCN IM to put pressure on the Indian government to resume the Naga peace talks, which have hit a dead end in the recent years. So reportedly, with the backing of NSCN IM, the DNLA has gained strength over the last couple of years. It has managed to procure weapons and even raise funds through extortion. And as a result, it has stepped up its violence in Assam and in the neighboring region. But reportedly, its true intent is to act as a proxy insurgent outfit of the NSCN IM. Now let's look at this article from page number 1. An eco-sensitive zone has been notified by the Union Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change around the sensitive Deepor Beel wetland. See, the Deepor Beel wetland is located on the outskirts of Guwahati, and it is a critical ecosystem which is home to several endangered and critically endangered species. This wetland happens to be one of the largest freshwater lakes in Assam and also the only Ramsar site in Assam. This wetland ecosystem has also been declared as an important bird area by BirdLife International, but this sensitive wetland was facing several environmental threats. The first major concern was with regard to the sewage that was being let into the wetland from Guwahati, which was releasing a lot of toxins into the ecosystem and polluting the wetland. The other threat was the construction activities and human activities in and around the wetland, which was destroying the ecosystem and thereby posing a direct threat to several threatened species which find a habitat in the Deepor Beel wetland. So, following the efforts of several wildlife activists, NGOs, and conservationists, finally the Union Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has declared an eco-sensitive zone around this wetland. With this notification, human activity in and around the designated area shall be strictly prohibited and regulated, and these restrictions will apply for commercial hotels and resorts, hydroelectric projects, brick factories, usage of firewood, discharge of untreated effluents, etc. This notification will help in tackling the problem of encroachment and also the threat posed by a railway track which was running inside the region, which was even a threat for elephants, which often make use of the Deepor Beel wetland. Next, on page number 10, we have an article that refers to the increasing threat being posed to the sensitive Himalayan ecosystem by multiple hydropower projects which have been approved by all the concerned ministries. We have discussed in previous sessions how hydropower projects in the Himalayas could be directly responsible for incidents of flooding, landslides, and other such natural disasters which have wreaked havoc in the Himalayan belt, especially in states such as Uttarakhand. While the Himalayan mountains have tremendous potential for hydropower, these large-scale projects, if constructed without following the environmental norms, can degrade the sensitive environment, thereby increasing the occurrence and the impact of such natural disasters. Despite these concerns, the government has been planning 7 hydroelectric projects in the upper reaches of the Ganga River in the state of Uttarakhand. Previously, the concerned ministries, that is the Union Water Ministry, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, and the Jal Shakti Ministry, they all had a difference of opinion with regard to approving these projects. But now, all the 3 ministries have come on the same page, and according to environmental activists, they have ignored the environmental issues and have given their final approval for executing these hydropower projects. However, the government has defended its stand by stating that all the environmental concerns have been factored in, and these projects are essential to address the electricity needs of the region. Then, coming to the final article on page 14, India and Australia have agreed to finalize an early harvest trade pact by the end of this year, which would further set the stage for a full comprehensive economic trade agreement, or essentially a free trade agreement, which is officially being referred to as the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement. India and Australia have agreed to speed up the discussions for reaching an interim early harvest trade pact, which will allow the free movement of goods and services between the two countries. And this would become the first foundation for eventually building up a much more comprehensive full-fledged economic agreement known as SECA, which would also cover investments. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: the recent appointment of 9 judges to the Supreme Court at one go is a welcome sign of cooperation between the judiciary and the executive. It augurs well for diversity and representation. Comment. The second question: India does not have the luxury of distance from the ticking time bomb in its neighborhood. Discuss in the context of emerging security dynamics in South Asia. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be shared in the description box below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.